Hi, it's Dwyer, gamblersadvisory.com, dwyervip.com. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Let's talk about Carl Frampton's win over Leo Santa Cruz. Simply put, this is why I watch boxing. If you're an elite fighter, you dream of winning a fight like this. If you're a fan, you dream of watching a fight like this. They're so special that even the elite fighters only have one or two of these their entire career. Now this fight spoiled us, like the thriller in Manila spoiled us. Right? The fight was that good. This fight was Leonard Hearns. This fight was Hagler Hearns. Lennox Lewis, Vitaly Klitschko. Carl Frampton and Leo Santa Cruz are now linked by a great performance, where both came, both delivered. We learned that regardless of the title, both are champions. Now, legacy-wise, in a fight like this, there really are no losers. Both men are much more highly regarded today than they were before they entered the ring. If either of them retired today, and you saw them 10 years from now, you'd think to yourself, warrior. This is why many men box. Now let me congratulate Carl Frampton. I picked Leo Santa Cruz in the fight, and I was wrong. Right? This video is really a video from someone who bet on Leo Santa Cruz. As I saw it, Carl Frampton won the fight. Now, the fight will get bigger in time. Two unbeaten guys enter the ring. Frampton crosses the Atlantic to get to the fight. Right? Frampton is outpunched by more than 15 punches per round. I want people to understand that Leo Santa Cruz in this fight, over 12 rounds, threw more than 1,000 punches and landed on 25% of his punches. Carl Frampton, by contrast, threw 668 punches. In other words, he throws more than 200 fewer punches. In fact, more than 300 fewer punches than Leo Santa Cruz. Right? But in the middle of a volume tsunami, right? And the volume wasn't as great as other Santa Cruz fights. In the middle of a volume tsunami, Carl Frampton keeps his cool. He keeps his hands on the wheel. Right? He sticks to his plan and he works it. Right? He lands over 35% of his punches in a fight where the opponent throws over 1,000. Right? Santa Cruz went for it. He was ready for the fight. He didn't have an off night. He came prepared. But he was in with a surgeon, a man who was far crisper, right? As we learned in the Thurman versus Porter fight, if you're able to deliver, if you're able to land heavy, crisp counters, you can offset volume and aggression in the court of public opinion, right? As the action went forward, I had two different thoughts, right? I was watching Santa Cruz's volume, and I thought, okay, who's going to be more physical in this fight? But for the entire fight, from early on, I thought it was clear that whoever won the fight, I know this is going to sound crazy, whoever won the fight, Carl Frampton was the better boxer. It's Frampton who is the technician. Now, you're going to hear a lot of information on this fight. Understand, contrary to what you've heard, there is a knockdown in the fight. Right? It's clear. It just wasn't acknowledged. But there is a knockdown in the fight. And it's early. It changes the course of the fight. What I want you to do is to go to the second round of this fight. Revisit it. Right? With about 48 seconds or so left in the second round. Carl Frampton gets off a left hand. By the way, his left hand's a big story in this fight. It's a huge story in this fight. He gets off a left hand. It's a great counter. Looks like a counter left hook. And I'll just say this. Santa Cruz, who up until this point looks like Goliath. He's the bigger man. He's throwing volume. He's on his front foot. It's his title. It's his country. I understand the crowd's a Frampton crowd. But Santa Cruz comes in clothed in the title. Right? It's at this moment that you realize that the shorter man has the power. He lands the left hand. Santa Cruz loses his balance. He literally falls backward, right? He tries to get his balance, but he doesn't quite. He falls backwards. Takes a couple of steps, falling backwards. The only thing that keeps him up, the only thing, are the ropes, right? Officially, that should have been counted as a knockdown, right? If it was, it would have been a jarring moment had the ref started the count, right? It would have been clear that Frampton was dominating the early rounds, that the narrative going into this fight, Frampton moving up in weight against an unbeaten champion. Would Frampton handle the weight? The narrative would have been dispelled by the crispness of that left hook. The unbeaten champ would have received a count. Right? If you're one of these people watching this video who has a scorecard that has a 1-point difference in the fight. Let's say you thought Santa Cruz won this fight by a round. And I'm guessing over time, a lot of people are going to revisit this film. Right? They're going to realize that Santa Cruz did do some things deep in the pocket. Right? That Santa Cruz has elements of Vitaly Klitschko defensively. Right? In other words, Santa Cruz always has a hand up. So when you throw, he's catching a lot on his forearms. Right? But let me tell you, if you recognize what should have been recognized, the knockdown in the second round, this fight's even wider than it was. Right? I thought the scoring was a bit too wide on 2 of the 3 judges' scorecards. Right? Understand, though, the judge that had this fight a draw, had he scored the second round 10-8, even he would have had Carl Frampton winning the fight. I encourage people to go back to that second round. It happened so suddenly that it caught the announcers off guard. Right? The ref missed it. Now, let's talk about why Frampton won. And I thought Frampton won by 2 or 3 rounds. You know, I just thought, simply put, in a sentence, that Frampton's performance had more variance and mastery. You know, as you saw Frampton framed what he was doing better than Leo Santa Cruz. In other words, Frampton at times moves away from the pocket, backs away, You see Santa Cruz coming in with punches, and you see Frampton with head movement, moving away from the punches. He looks good. Frampton sometimes gets deep in the pocket, doesn't throw punches. You know, it's like watching a movie with a really good actor, where as you're watching the guy and scene after scene, you're drawn to him and you wonder what he's thinking. Right? Frampton clearly had more defense, had more head movement, had more of a vertical game. There are actually times in this fight where Frampton goes down on his knees. Then he pops back up. Right? I'm not saying he's Pernell Whitaker, but let's say he had more of a vertical game than Leo Santa Cruz. Right? Frampton had more of a change of pace. At times, Frampton would drop his hands. Right? Frampton also had some tools that, with stunning regularity, reestablished themselves. I want you to key on Frampton's left hand. This is another one of those cases where as I look at Frampton, I'm not quite sure if he's a southpaw fighting right-handed or what. But Frampton's best punch, I'm convinced, especially now, is that left hook. Right? Frampton is a bit like Terrence Crawford. Right? He's a bit like Saul Alvarez. He has an outsized left hook. It's interesting because later in the fight, 10th round, and keep in mind, this is a make or break part of the fight for Leo Santa Cruz. Trust me, I bet on Santa Cruz. I was hoping for a comeback. You're going to notice that that left hand to the body slowed down Santa Cruz to the point where in the 10th round, when the fight looked to be on the table, when Santa Cruz understood his title hung in the balance, Santa Cruz takes the 10th round off. Right? The pace slows dramatically. As you watch the 10th round, you kind of sense that Santa Cruz was cognizant of Carl Frampton's left to the body. Right? Picture it, Santa Cruz of all people, being a little bit hesitant jumping in. This is in a fight he knows is close. Right? This is with his title on the line, needing every minute in a fight in which Frampton started fast. Right? Santa Cruz needed to pace himself in the 10th. The reason is because Carl Frampton is a master counterpuncher who was landing at a high percentage, and he had put in the work with left hooks to the body, where Santa Cruz understood there was a price to pay to get close. Right? Let me say this too. There's a psychological component here, isn't there? First, Santa Cruz takes this fight, in part because Carl Frampton had a near car crash recently, right, where Frampton gets dropped twice early in a fight. Santa Cruz talked about that fight in the build-up to this fight. Right, so here's Carl Frampton. And Carl Frampton comes out in the first round, he has a lot of charisma. Right, as I said, because of his variance, because you don't quite know front foot or back foot, lead with the jab or lead with a power shot, right? Which punch is the real punch that Carl Frampton is throwing? In other words, he's a vet doing vet stuff, right? He's not a pattern fighter, right? He's adjusting to the moment. He's the strategist in the ring. And all I'm saying is, in the second round, I know it's not called a knockdown, even though it should have been. But Leo Santa Cruz at that point understood. He understood, even as he was on his front foot. He understood that the little guy could knock him out. The little guy from the lower weight class. I think that had a huge impact. Right? Carl Frampton understood look, I have the punch to stop this guy. That should have been a knockdown. Frampton's people aren't going to cry about it. Carl Frampton got off to a fast start as it was. Steve Farhood gave Frampton something like the first 4 rounds of the fight. The guy scoring on Showtime TV, right? But Frampton knew at that point. And so it's interesting because Frampton is taking his time, landing a high percentage of his shots. You get into the mid-30s, folks, that's a high percentage. That's a high percentage. Right? And all I'm saying is Santa Cruz couldn't get out of character. Right? Santa Cruz's game, he's doing the same things repeatedly. Now, there's a subtle brilliance to what Santa Cruz does, right? As I said earlier, you'll notice his hands are up. His shoulders are always a little bit off at the side. I thought when they mixed it up, as Frampton's backing away, I thought Santa Cruz had his best moments, right? Santa Cruz is a guy who throws combinations, right? So even after he lands a couple of shots, he continues to throw. Here's what Santa Cruz didn't do, and it hurt him. Frampton's jumping straight back, kind of like Sergei Kovalev, right? He's jumping straight back a lot of the fight. I'm just telling you that, foot speed, there's a read and recognition to it. I don't understand why Santa Cruz didn't follow him aggressively. In other words, if you know Frampton's jumping straight back, if you know Frampton can't match your volume, folks, he's not within 200 in the number of punches thrown, why wouldn't you keep the party going? You're having a shootout with the guy, he jumps straight back. Why wouldn't you use the shootout as a pretense to jump straight back with him? Follow him after the ambush. Right? Santa Cruz is local. He's not the guy who aggressively follows you after the ambush. Right? He's not the guy running across the ring with you as you try to back away. Let me say this too, just my own thoughts. You see a charismatic guy like this, and I'm serious, as I'm watching the fight, and I was rolling with Santa Cruz in this fight. As I'm watching the fight, I'm wondering what the hell Carl Frampton is thinking. Right? He has that kind of presence. Right? He looks like he's making adjustments. He's a guy changing speeds as opposed to fighting the same speed all the time. Right? He seemed to be setting traps. It felt like I was watching a faster version of Juan Manuel Marquez. Right? Who, in all fairness to Marquez, is older now. Right? Marquez is in his 40s. Frampton's still in his 20s. Right? And so it was a little bit jarring to me to realize that Frampton was throwing the straighter punches. That's key in this fight, right? Because Frampton would get there first, and Frampton had the hand speed advantage. Right? So I thought, okay, Santa Cruz has to realize, just hearing the crowd, just knowing that the second round should have been called a knockdown. I thought Santa Cruz should have sensed a little bit more urgency and should have just dropped his head and run inside. He wouldn't even have to throw punches, because the point of following a guy after the ambush is to just stay up on his chest. Right? So then when he gets to where he's going and you get to where you're going, you're able to throw punches. 12th round's fascinating. Al Bernstein, with about 30 or 40 seconds left, says, it looks to me like Leo Santa Cruz is trying to gather his thoughts. Right? I'm telling you, Frampton's hard counters were harder than you and I envisioned. The fight ends with Frampton having Santa Cruz with his back up against the ropes. You got to be kidding me. if you're Leo Santa Cruz, and you know the other guy's landing at a higher percentage, the harder shots, and they're framed. In other words, you see Frampton, they're apart, then Frampton goes, pow, right? They're framed. You notice the harder shots, right? Frampton's not smothering his punches, coming in, throwing a bunch of punches, but he's landing some good short ones. No, Frampton's punches are the kind the crowd sees. So if you're Santa Cruz, wouldn't you have to physically maul him? You want to see a fight where a guy gets mauled? Bernard Hopkins, back in the day, against, believe it or not, Kovalev's current trainer, John David Jackson. Right? There are times in that fight where Hopkins is just running up on him. Right? Because you understand, look, I'm fighting a technician who's too precise from the outside. Right? He's landing hard counters at too high of a percentage rate. Plus, if I'm Santa Cruz, a taller guy, my operating theory would be that no one roots for Goliath. Right? Well, let me say this. After the fight, Santa Cruz said, hey, I'll fight him in LA, I'll fight him in Belfast. I know Santa Cruz won more rounds in the second half of the fight than he did the first half of the fight. But you're kidding yourself if you think you're going to beat a charismatic guy like this. A guy who frames his punches. A guy who has a back foot and a front foot. Right? A guy who, before the scores were announced, had a chief rival, Guillermo Regundio, on Twitter. I was on Twitter. Guillermo tweets, congratulations to Carl Frampton. This is before the scores were announced. Right? Even Frampton's rival, who would get paid fighting either guy, knew that Frampton had won the fight. Right? I think Santa Cruz in Belfast is a suicide run. Right? I think that's a suicide run because Frampton, all I'm saying is an adaptive, reactive fighter in a rematch is hard to bet against. Right? Because who's going to make the adjustments? Which one of these two guys is going to sit down, look at film and say, okay, this worked and that worked? My point, too, is I'm sure as Frampton looks at the film, and keep in mind, this fight, Frampton had to be wary of pacing, as it was. He doesn't throw 700 punches in this fight. Right, next fight, Frampton's going to realize, look, that left, if he looks at the film, he's going to realize that left was landing effectively the entire 12 rounds. Right? That second round, that's a knockdown. Had I not been obsessed with pacing and thought more about a stoppage, right? Had I realized that Leo Santa Cruz would end the fight with his back up against the ropes and would be lethargic in the 10th round, the younger guy would need the breather in the 10th round. Maybe Frampton goes for a stoppage in the next fight. Let me say this too, and I don't say it lightly. These fights, right? Ishmael Vasquez against Rafael Marquez, right? That series, right? Ali Fraser. You really can't have too many of these fights back to back to back, because these fights take a lot out of you. Right? This was the most rough and tumble fight, in my opinion, either guy has had. This was the opposite of Frampton Scott Quigg. Right there, that's a low volume fight. Right? Not a lot of action the first half of that fight. This fight was action from start to finish. The fighters have to be selfish. I agree. A rematch between these two would be great for fans like us. In my opinion, physically, it wouldn't be great for either fighter's career. Right? If I'm Frampton, my next fight's going to be against a guy who's going to throw less than 1,000 punches in a 12-round fight. If I'm Santa Cruz, my next fight's going to be against a guy who doesn't have a lethal left hook. Right? I'd like to see these guys fight again, but I'd also like to see these guys get paid, have their bodies recover, take care of their families, get money. Guys, your profile has never been higher. Take a breather. You've earned it. Let me just say this in closing too. I wish I'd have been able to have come on here and said, hey man, Leo Santa Cruz won this fight just like I told you he would. I can't. As much as I love Leo Santa Cruz, and I still think he'd beat Guillermo Rigondeaux, as much as I love him, he lost this fight. He was outthought in the ring. Quite frankly, he was out hit in the ring. Right? I congratulate Carl Frampton on really an epic victory. One, in my opinion, that's going to be a classic, considered a classic by fight fans for years. Understand, Carl Frampton has reached a point. Leo Santa Cruz has reached a point where, as I said, if these guys were to walk away from the sport and then show up someplace 10 years later, you would look at them and you would say, wow, that guy was a warrior. Wow, that was a great fight. You know what I mean? Wow, that guy really brought it, didn't he? If this is the only loss of Leo Santa Cruz's career, we're going to remember it fondly. Right? You're going to look at Santa Cruz and the loss is going to further validate his success. Because you'll say, man, even the fight he lost, wow, he had his moments in that fight, didn't he? Right? So I congratulate both men. Really, both men are winners. This is a win-win-win. They win, we won. Great fight. I'm more than impressed by Carl Frampton's left hook. That's really a great punch. Anyway, that's how I see it. Let me hear from you. Tell me what surprised you in the fight. Tell me if there are, in your opinion, any other things the ref overlooked in the fight. I thought Harvey Dock did an outstanding job, but he blew the second round. We'd be talking about this fight a lot differently if people said, oh yeah, Frampton got a knockdown in the second round. Trust me, there'd be much more urgency in the third, fourth, fifth, and sixth rounds. Wouldn't there? We'd be discussing the 12th round a bit differently. Anyway, that's how I see it. Let me hear from you. Thanks for stopping by.